Zeno of Citium begins his philosophy in a world that feels unstable, uncertain, and often beyond control. Born in a time shaped by political change and personal loss, his thinking does not begin with abstract curiosity alone, but with a practical question that touches every human life. How can a person remain steady in a world that is constantly shifting, where fortune rises and falls without warning, and where external events seem to have the power to disturb the mind at any moment? He does not look for answers in wealth, power, or reputation, because these are precisely the things that are most vulnerable to change. Instead, he turns inward, asking what within a person can remain stable regardless of what happens outside. This search leads him to a principle that becomes the foundation of Stoic philosophy. The good life does not depend on external conditions, but on the state of the mind itself. To understand this, he begins with the structure of reality. The universe, in his view, is not chaotic or random. It is ordered, rational, and governed by a principle that gives it coherence and direction. This principle is often described as reason, not in the limited sense of human thought, but as a universal force that shapes everything that exists. It is present in nature, in change, and in the unfolding of events. Nothing happens outside of this order. Human beings are not separate from this structure. They are part of it. And more importantly, they possess within themselves a share of this rational principle. The human mind is capable of understanding, of recognizing patterns, and of aligning itself with the order of the world. This capacity becomes the key to living well. From here, the idea of living in accordance with nature begins to take shape. This phrase does not mean simply following instincts or doing whatever feels natural in a moment. It refers to living in harmony with a rational structure that governs the universe. Since human beings possess reason, living according to nature means living according to reason, allowing understanding to guide thought and action. This shifts the focus of life away from external outcomes and toward internal alignment. A person cannot control everything that happens, but they can control how they respond. They can examine their judgments, question their reactions, and choose whether to let external events disturb their inner state. This distinction between what is within control and what is not becomes central. External events, such as wealth, health, reputation, and even the actions of others, are not fully within a person's power. They are influenced by many factors beyond individual control. But one's own judgments, choices, and attitudes belong to the individual. These are the things that can be shaped through reason. By focusing on what is within control and accepting what is not, a person can achieve a form of stability that does not depend on changing circumstances. This does not remove difficulty from life, but it changes the way difficulty is experienced. Instead of being overwhelmed by events, the individual learns to meet them with clarity and balance. This approach leads to a redefinition of what is truly valuable. Many things that people usually pursue are not rejected entirely, but they are no longer seen as essential to a good life. Wealth, for example, can be useful, but it is not necessary for happiness. Health can be preferred, but its absence does not make a life meaningless. These things are considered indifferent in the sense that they do not determine the quality of a person's character. What truly matters is virtue, which for Zeno is not a vague moral idea, but a precise state of the mind. Virtue is the alignment of one's thoughts and actions with reason. It is the condition in which a person understands what is within their control, acts accordingly, and remains consistent regardless of external changes. This creates a form of independence that is not based on isolation, but on inner stability. A person who has developed this state is not easily shaken by success or failure. They do not become overly attached to what they gain, nor do they collapse when they lose something. Their sense of self is grounded in something more stable than circumstance. At the same time, this does not lead to withdrawal from the world. Zeno's philosophy does not encourage indifference to others or disengagement from society. On the contrary, it recognizes that human beings are naturally social. They are part of a larger community, and their actions affect those around them. Living according to reason, therefore, includes living in a way that contributes to the well-being of others. Justice, cooperation, and mutual respect become natural extensions of a rational life. A person who understands the structure of reality also understands their place within it, not as an isolated individual, but as part of a larger whole. This connection to others is not based on external obligation alone, but on a deeper recognition of shared nature. All human beings possess reason, and this creates a bond that goes beyond differences in status, culture, or circumstance. It suggests that there is a universal aspect to human life that connects individuals across boundaries. From this perspective, the idea of a well-ordered society emerges. Such a society is not defined only by laws or institutions, but by the character of its people. When individuals act according to reason, their actions naturally align with one another, creating harmony without the need for constant enforcement. However, Zeno is aware that most people do not reach this state easily. The path to inner stability requires discipline, reflection, and continuous effort. It involves examining one's own thoughts, identifying where judgments are mistaken, and gradually reshaping them. This process is not immediate. It unfolds over time, as habits are formed and understanding deepens. The mind learns to distinguish between what truly matters and what is not, between what is within control and what is not, and between reactions that arise automatically and those that are guided by reason. As this development continues, a transformation begins to take place. Emotions that once seemed overwhelming become more manageable. Reactions that were once automatic become more deliberate. The individual gains a greater sense of clarity and control over their own inner life. This does not mean that all emotion disappears. Rather, emotion becomes aligned with reason instead of opposing it. Fear, anger, and excessive desire lose their grip because they are based on mistaken judgments about what is truly important. When those judgments change, the emotional response changes as well. In this way, the goal is not to suppress emotion, but to understand it and bring it into harmony with reason. The result is a state of balance, where the mind is no longer pulled in conflicting directions, but moves in a consistent and coherent way. As these ideas take shape, a clear picture of Zeno's philosophy begins to emerge. It is a philosophy grounded in the belief that the world is ordered, that human beings are capable of understanding that order, and that the good life comes from aligning oneself with it. It is not a philosophy that promises control over external events, but one that offers a way to remain stable regardless of them. It shifts the focus from what happens to a person to how that person responds, and in doing so, it places the possibility of a good life within the reach of anyone willing to develop their understanding and discipline their mind. And as this foundation settles, the deeper layers of his philosophy continue to unfold, exploring how reason shapes not only individual life, but the structure of society, how discipline becomes a way of living rather than a temporary effort, and how the pursuit of virtue transforms the entire experience of existence into something steady, coherent, and resilient. As this foundation settles more deeply into the mind, the focus shifts from the initial distinction between what can and cannot be controlled toward a more precise examination of how the mind actually forms its judgments. Because for Zeno, the disturbance that people experience does not come directly from events themselves, but from the way those events are interpreted. The same situation can affect two individuals in entirely different ways, not because the situation changes, but because their judgments about it are different. This observation becomes central because it means that stability is not achieved by changing the world, but by refining the way the mind responds to it. Every experience begins with what appears to the mind, a presentation that arrives through the senses or through thought. These appearances are immediate and often powerful, but they are not yet beliefs. They are simply impressions. The crucial step comes after, when the mind either accepts or rejects what is presented. This act of acceptance, this agreement with the impression, is what forms judgment. Zeno places great importance on this moment, because it is here that freedom operates. A person may not be able to prevent impressions from arising, but they're not forced to agree with them. They can pause, examine, and decide whether what appears is actually true or not. This small space between impression and judgment becomes the point where discipline begins. Most people do not notice this distinction. They move directly from impression to reaction, treating every appearance as if it were a fact. If something seems threatening, they feel fear. If something appears desirable, they feel desire. If something appears offensive, they feel anger. But in each case, the emotion is not caused by the event itself. It is caused by the judgment that the event is good or bad in a certain way. Once this is understood, the entire structure of emotional life begins to change. Emotions are no longer seen as uncontrollable forces, but as responses shaped by belief. If the belief changes, the emotional response changes with it. This does not happen instantly because habits of thought are deeply ingrained, but it shows that transformation is possible. From here, Zeno develops the idea that the mind must be trained to recognize which impressions are reliable and which are not. Some impressions are clear, stable, and consistent with reason. These can be trusted. Others are confused, exaggerated, or based on incomplete understanding. These must be questioned. This process of examination requires attention and practice. It is not enough to know in theory that judgments matter. The mind must learn to slow down, to observe its own reactions, and to separate appearance from truth. Over time, this creates a new habit where the immediate reaction is no longer automatic acceptance, but careful evaluation. As this habit develops, the intensity of emotional disturbance begins to weaken. Situations that once triggered strong reactions lose their power, not because they have changed, but because the interpretation has changed. The mind becomes less vulnerable to sudden shifts in feeling, more capable of maintaining balance, even in difficult circumstances. This leads to a clearer understanding of what Zeno considers true emotional disturbance. It is not the presence of feeling itself, but the presence of false judgment. When the mind incorrectly believes that something external is absolutely necessary for happiness, it becomes attached. When it believes that something external is a complete disaster, it becomes fearful or distressed. By correcting these beliefs, the mind gradually frees itself from these extremes. It no longer treats external things as if they determine its entire state. Instead, it sees them as events that may be preferred or not preferred, but not as ultimate goods or evils. This distinction creates a different relationship with the world. A person may still prefer health over illness, success over failure, or comfort over difficulty, but these preferences do not control their inner state. If circumstances change, the mind adapts without collapsing because it has not tied its well-being entirely to those conditions. At the same time, this does not lead to passivity. Zeno does not suggest that a person should stop acting or stop caring about outcomes. Action remains important, but it is guided by reason rather than by uncontrolled emotion. A person acts where they can, makes choices where possible, and accepts the results without becoming internally disturbed. This balance between action and acceptance becomes a defining feature of Stoic life. One acts fully in the present moment, using reason to guide decisions, but does not attach one's sense of worth or happiness to the outcome. The effort is within control, the result is not. From this, a deeper form of discipline emerges, one that is not based on rigid rules but on continuous awareness. The mind becomes attentive to itself, noticing when it begins to drift into false judgments and gently correcting them. This is not a one-time correction, but an ongoing practice that continues throughout life. As this practice becomes more stable, a new kind of emotional state appears. It is not the absence of feeling, but a form of calm that is not easily disrupted. Instead of being pulled in different directions by changing events, the mind remains centered. It experiences what happens, but does not lose its balance. This state is often misunderstood as indifference, but it is not a lack of care. It is a different kind of care, one that is not dependent on control over external things. A person in this state can engage fully with life, form relationships, take action, and pursue goals, but without becoming internally unstable when circumstances shift. This also affects how a person relates to others. Since all human beings are subject to the same patterns of judgment and error, there is a greater sense of understanding and patience. Instead of reacting with anger to the mistakes of others, there is a recognition that those mistakes arise from false beliefs. This does not remove responsibility, but it changes the way responses are shaped. The idea of community becomes stronger at this stage. Human beings are not isolated individuals trying to protect themselves from the world. They are part of a larger whole, connected through shared reason. Acting in accordance with reason, therefore, includes acting in a way that supports others, contributes to stability, and maintains fairness. Justice, in this sense, is not imposed from outside, but arises naturally from a correct understanding of human nature. When a person recognizes that others are also rational beings, capable of understanding and deserving of respect, their actions begin to reflect that recognition. As all of this develops, the philosophy becomes less about isolated ideas and more about a way of living. It is no longer only a set of principles to be understood, but a continuous practice that shapes perception, thought, emotion, and action at every moment. The more this practice deepens, the more the individual begins to experience a kind of freedom that does not depend on circumstances. It is not the freedom to control everything, but the freedom to remain steady regardless of what happens. It is the freedom that comes from understanding what truly matters and letting go of what is not. And as this understanding continues to settle and expand, it begins to shape not only the inner life of the individual, but also their place within the wider world, where reason, discipline, and human connection come together to form a life that is both stable and deeply engaged with everything that unfolds. As this inner discipline becomes more stable, the philosophy begins to extend beyond the individual mind into a broader understanding of human life as something deeply connected, where the same rational structure that guides personal stability also shapes relationships, community, and the place of a person within the world as a whole. What began as a way to remain undisturbed in the face of change now becomes a way to live meaningfully among others, without losing that inner balance. At this stage, the idea of human nature becomes more clearly defined. A human being is not only a rational individual, but also a social one. The capacity for reason is not meant to isolate a person from others, but to connect them more deeply. The same principle that allows one to examine one's own thoughts also allows one to recognize that others share this capacity. This recognition forms the basis of a wider sense of belonging, one that goes beyond immediate relationships and extends to all human beings. From this perspective, the idea of a larger human community begins to take shape. It is not limited by boundaries of place, culture, or status. Instead, it is defined by shared rationality. All people, regardless of their circumstances, participate in the same fundamental structure. This creates a form of unity that is not imposed from outside, but arises naturally from understanding. This unity does not erase differences. Individuals still have different roles, abilities, and positions within society, but these differences do not divide them in a fundamental way. They are variations within a larger whole, where each part contributes to the functioning of the system. Just as the parts of a living body perform different tasks while supporting the life of the whole, individuals contribute to the stability and harmony of the community. Within this framework, the idea of duty takes on a more refined meaning. Duty is not simply a set of external obligations, but a natural extension of understanding. When a person recognizes their place within a larger structure, their actions begin to reflect that recognition. They act not only for personal benefit, but in a way that maintains balance within the whole. This does not require constant sacrifice or denial. Instead, it creates alignment between personal and collective well-being. When actions are guided by reason, they tend to support both the individual and the community at the same time. Conflict arises when actions are driven by false judgments, when individuals pursue what appears beneficial in the short term but disrupts the larger structure. Zeno's philosophy, therefore, encourages a form of engagement that is steady and thoughtful. A person does not withdraw from society, nor do they lose themselves in it. They remain aware of their own internal state while participating fully in the life around them. This balance allows them to contribute without becoming overwhelmed. At the same time, this broader perspective reshapes how one responds to difficulty, especially when it involves other people. Conflict, misunderstanding, and injustice are part of human life, but they're no longer seen as reasons for uncontrolled reaction. Instead, they're approached with the same clarity that is applied to personal challenges. When another person acts in a harmful or unreasonable way, the immediate impulse may be anger or frustration. But through the lens of this philosophy, such actions are understood as the result of false judgments. The person is acting based on what they believe to be good or necessary, even if that belief is mistaken. Recognizing this does not excuse the action, but it changes the response. Instead of reacting with equal disturbance, the individual can respond with a form of measured clarity. They can address the situation without losing their own balance, correcting where possible, accepting where necessary, and maintaining their own alignment with reason throughout. This approach strengthens relationships rather than weakening them. It creates the possibility of interaction without escalation, of correction without hostility, and of cooperation even in the presence of disagreement. It allows a person to remain consistent in their behavior, rather than being pulled into the fluctuations of others. As this way of living develops, it also begins to influence how one sees larger events, not just personal interactions, but the unfolding of life as a whole. Success and failure, gain and loss, recognition and obscurity, all take on a different meaning. They are no longer treated as defining moments that determine the value of a life, but as events within a larger process that does not depend entirely on them. This perspective brings a sense of proportion. It becomes easier to see that many things that once seemed overwhelming are only temporary, only part of a much larger sequence. This does not make them unimportant, but it places them in context, reducing their power to disturb. At the same time, it deepens the sense of responsibility. Because external outcomes are not the measure of a good life, the focus returns to the quality of action itself. What matters is not only what happens, but how one acts within what happens. This creates a form of consistency that does not rely on circumstance. Over time, this consistency becomes a defining feature of character. A person is no longer shaped primarily by external events, but by their own developed understanding. Their responses become more predictable, not in a rigid way, but in a stable one. Others can rely on them, not because they control outcomes, but because they maintain their balance regardless of them. This stability also creates a kind of quiet strength. It is not dramatic or outwardly forceful, but it is persistent. It allows a person to continue acting with clarity even when conditions are difficult, to remain engaged without becoming overwhelmed, and to maintain direction without becoming rigid. As all of these elements come together, the philosophy becomes less about individual ideas and more about a complete way of being. Thought, emotion, action, and relationship all begin to align under the same principle, creating a life that is coherent from within. This coherence does not remove complexity, but it makes it manageable. It allows a person to move through changing conditions without losing their sense of direction, to engage with others without losing themselves, and to act with purpose without becoming dependent on outcomes. In this way, the individual becomes not separate from the world, but properly situated within it, aware of both their own inner structure and their place within the larger whole, moving steadily through life with a clarity that does not need to resist change, but instead works in harmony with it. As this way of living settles fully into place, everything begins to gather into a single, continuous understanding where the individual, the world, and the unfolding of events are no longer experienced as separate or opposing forces, but as parts of one coherent order. What once appeared as conflict between inner life and outer circumstance now reveals itself as a misunderstanding that has gradually been resolved through the discipline of thought and the refinement of judgment. The world, in this view, is not something that must be resisted or controlled in order to live well. It is something to be understood. Its changes, its unpredictability, its moments of difficulty and ease are all expressions of a larger structure that does not exist for or against any one individual, but unfolds according to its own rational pattern. To live well is not to demand that this pattern adjust to personal preference, but to bring one's own thinking into alignment with it. This alignment does not happen through a single realization. It develops over time. As the mind learns to recognize where it has been assigning value incorrectly, where it has been attaching itself to what cannot be held, and where it has been resisting what cannot be avoided. Each correction removes a small source of disturbance, and over time these corrections accumulate, creating a state that is more stable, more consistent, and less dependent on what happens externally. At this stage, the distinction between what is within control and what is not is no longer just an idea that must be remembered. It becomes a natural way of seeing. The mind no longer reaches outward in the same restless way, trying to secure outcomes or avoid every form of discomfort. Instead, it directs its attention inward toward the quality of its own judgments, where real influence exists. This shift creates a profound change in how life is experienced. Events still occur, circumstances still change, but their impact is different. What once triggered strong reactions now passes through a more stable awareness. There is still recognition of difficulty, still awareness of loss or challenge, but without the added layer of resistance that once amplified these experiences. From this emerges a form of calm that is not fragile. It does not depend on quiet surroundings or favorable conditions. It exists even in the presence of noise, change, and uncertainty. This calm is not the absence of activity, but the presence of order within the mind itself. At the same time, this state does not remove engagement with life. On the contrary, it allows for deeper engagement, because the mind is no longer preoccupied with controlling what cannot be controlled. It becomes more present in what it does. Actions are carried out with attention and care, not because they guarantee a certain outcome, but because they are expressions of a clear and stable understanding. This creates a form of effort that is steady rather than strained. A person acts fully, commits to what they are doing, and uses their reason to guide each step, but without the tension that comes from attaching their entire well-being to the result. When the result arrives, whether it aligns with preference or not, it is received without collapse or excessive attachment. Over time, this way of acting shapes the entire character of the individual. There is a consistency that develops, not imposed from outside rules, but arising naturally from understanding. Decisions become clearer, not because situations are simpler, but because the principles guiding those decisions are stable. This stability extends into every part of life. In moments of success, there is no overwhelming pride that distorts judgment. In moments of difficulty, there is no despair that removes direction. Both are understood as temporary conditions within a larger process. The individual remains centered, neither elevated beyond reason nor brought below it. This creates a kind of independence that is often misunderstood. It is not independence from others or from the world, but independence from a need for external conditions to determine one's inner state. A person in this condition can participate fully in relationships, in work, in society, while maintaining a steady core that is not easily shaken. At the same time, this independence strengthens connection rather than weakening it. Because the individual is no longer driven by excessive attachment or fear, their relationships become more balanced. They are able to care without clinging, to support without controlling, and to respond without being overwhelmed. This balance reflects a deeper understanding of human life as something shared. Every person is part of the same larger order, subject to the same patterns of change, the same limits of control, and the same capacity for reason. Recognizing this creates a sense of connection that is not based on circumstance, but on a shared structure of existence. From this perspective, actions toward others become more measured and more just. There is less impulse to react harshly, less tendency to take offense where none is necessary, and a greater ability to respond in a way that maintains both personal stability and collective harmony. Even in situations where conflict cannot be avoided, the response remains grounded. A person can act firmly when needed, can resist what must be resisted, but without losing their internal balance. Their actions are guided by understanding rather than by uncontrolled reaction. As all of this comes together, the philosophy reveals its final shape, not as a set of rules or isolated ideas, but as a continuous practice that touches every moment of life. It is present in how one thinks, how one feels, how one acts, and how one relates to others. It is not something separate from daily life, but something that transforms daily life from within. The ultimate result is not perfection in the sense of never experiencing difficulty, but steadiness in the face of it. It is a life where clarity replaces confusion, where reason guides action, and where the mind is no longer pulled apart by conflicting judgments. In the end, what emerges is a way of being that is quiet but deeply resilient, where the individual moves through a changing world without losing their center, where external events no longer dictate inner stability, and where the simple act of aligning thought with reason becomes the foundation for a life that is coherent, balanced, and enduring. Zeno of Citium was born around 334 BCE in the city of Citium on the island of Cyprus, at a time when the ancient world was still absorbing the impact of Alexander the Great's conquests. The old city-states of Greece were no longer the dominant centers of power they once were. Instead, a wider, more uncertain world was emerging, one where cultures mixed, political structures shifted, and individuals often found themselves disconnected from the stability that earlier generations had taken for granted. Into this changing landscape came a thinker whose philosophy would not focus on abstract, metaphysical systems or distant theories of reality, but on something far more immediate and enduring. How should a person live in a world that feels unstable, unpredictable, and beyond their control? Very little is known about his early life with certainty, but what is often recounted is the turning point that brought him into philosophy. He was originally a merchant, involved in trade, moving goods across the Mediterranean. At some point, his ship was wrecked, and with it, much of what he had built. This moment is often described not just as a loss, but as a redirection. Stripped of his previous path, he arrived in Athens, which remained a major center of philosophical activity. There, he encountered the works of earlier thinkers, particularly Socrates, whose life and death had already become a powerful example of philosophical commitment. He also studied under different schools, including the Cynics, who emphasized simplicity, self-control, and independence from external conditions. These influences shaped the foundation of his thinking, but he did not simply adopt them. He began to form his own approach, one that would eventually become known as Stoicism. At its core, his philosophy begins with a simple but demanding observation. Human beings suffer not because of what happens to them, but because of how they interpret what happens. Events themselves are often beyond control. What remains within control is judgment, the way those events are understood and responded to. This distinction becomes the center of his entire system. He argued that the world operates according to a rational order, something structured and consistent, even if it is not always visible. This order is not shaped by individual desires. It exists independently, unfolding according to its own principles. Trying to control it directly leads to frustration because much of it lies outside human influence. But within this larger structure, there is a space that remains open, the space of judgment. A person cannot control whether they lose wealth, face hardship, or encounter uncertainty, but they can control how they respond to those situations. They can choose whether to see them as disasters or as events that can be faced with clarity and composure. This does not mean ignoring difficulty or pretending that loss is pleasant. It means recognizing that suffering is amplified by the way events are interpreted. Remove the unnecessary judgments, and much of that suffering begins to change. From this starting point, his philosophy builds toward a deeper understanding of what it means to live well. He introduces the idea that the goal of life is not pleasure, not wealth, not status, but living in accordance with nature. This phrase, often repeated, carries a specific meaning in his system. It does not refer to returning to a primitive state or rejecting society. It refers to aligning one's actions and thoughts with the rational structure of reality itself. To live according to nature is to understand what is within control and what is not, to act with reason rather than impulse, and to accept the unfolding of events without resistance to what cannot be changed. This acceptance is not passive. It does not mean doing nothing. It means focusing effort where it can actually make a difference and not wasting energy fighting against what lies beyond reach. At the same time, he places a strong emphasis on virtue. Virtue, in his view, is not one quality among many. It is the only true good. Everything else, health, wealth, reputation, is secondary. These things can be preferred, but they do not determine whether a life is good. A person can lose all external advantages and still live well, if they maintain clarity, discipline, and alignment with reason. Conversely, a person can possess everything and still live poorly, if their thinking is disordered and their actions lack direction. This idea gives his philosophy a kind of independence from external conditions. It suggests that the quality of life is not determined by circumstances alone, but by the internal state of the individual. At the same time, he did not advocate isolation from society. Unlike some earlier thinkers who withdrew completely, he believed that human beings are naturally social. Living according to nature includes participating in the community, fulfilling roles, and contributing to the larger structure of human life. This creates a balance within his system. On one hand, independence from external events. On the other, engagement with society. A person must act within the world, but not be controlled by it. As his teaching developed, he began to gather students and eventually taught in Athens at a place known as the Stoa, a public colonnade from which Stoicism takes its name. His approach was not based on elaborate lectures filled with abstract speculation. It was practical, focused on how philosophy can be applied to everyday life. What made his teaching distinctive was its directness. He was not offering escape from reality. He was offering a way to face it without being overwhelmed. By the time his early philosophy had taken shape, he had already established the foundation of a system that would influence generations of thinkers. A philosophy built not on controlling the world, but on understanding it. Not on avoiding difficulty, but on meeting it with stability. And in doing so, he introduced an idea that continues to resonate. That even in a world that cannot be controlled, there remains something that can. The way one chooses to think, to judge, and to respond. As his teaching began to take deeper form, what became increasingly clear was that his philosophy was not meant to remain as a set of general principles, but as a disciplined way of living that required constant attention. It was not enough to understand the distinction between what is within control and what is not. That understanding had to be practiced, tested, and reinforced in the face of real situations where emotions, habits, and impulses often override clarity. He recognized that the greatest obstacle to this way of life was not the external world, but the internal reactions that arise automatically. People do not simply experience events. They interpret them instantly, often without awareness. A loss becomes a disaster. A delay becomes an insult. A setback becomes a personal failure. These judgments happen so quickly that they feel inseparable from the events themselves. This is where his philosophy becomes more demanding. It requires a separation between the event and the interpretation of the event. A moment of pause, where the mind steps back and examines what is actually happening, rather than immediately reacting to what it seems to mean. This pause is not natural. It must be developed. It requires training the mind to recognize its own patterns, to question its own assumptions, and to resist the urge to turn every experience into something personal and emotionally charged. He understood that this process is difficult because human beings are deeply influenced by habit. The way a person reacts today is shaped by how they have reacted in the past. Without deliberate effort, those patterns continue, reinforcing themselves over time. This is why he placed such importance on discipline. Not discipline in the sense of strict rules imposed from outside, but discipline as a form of self-governance. The ability to guide one's own thoughts, to maintain clarity even when emotions rise, and to act in a way that reflects understanding rather than impulse. At the same time, he began to develop a more structured view of emotions themselves. He did not argue that emotions should be completely removed, but he distinguished between those that arise from clear understanding and those that arise from false judgment. When a person believes that something outside their control is absolutely necessary for their well-being, they become vulnerable. Fear, anxiety, and frustration follow naturally from that belief. But when a person understands that external conditions do not define the quality of life, those reactions begin to change. This does not eliminate all emotional experience, but transforms it. Instead of being driven by fear of loss or desire for control, a person could develop a more stable emotional state, one that is less dependent on circumstances and more grounded in understanding. He also expanded his idea of living in accordance with nature by connecting it more directly to reason. Nature, in his philosophy, is not simply the physical world. It is the rational structure that underlies existence. To live according to nature is to align with that structure, to think clearly, to act consistently, and to accept the unfolding of events without unnecessary resistance. This acceptance is often misunderstood as passivity, but in his system, it is the opposite. It is a form of clarity that allows action to be directed more effectively. When energy is not wasted on resisting what cannot be changed, it becomes available for what can be influenced. This leads to a more focused way of living. Attention shifts away from outcomes that are uncertain and toward actions that are within reach. Effort is directed toward behavior, judgment, and intention rather than external results. At the same time, he reinforced the importance of community. Human beings, in his view, are not isolated individuals. They are part of a larger network, connected through shared existence and mutual dependence. Living according to nature includes recognizing this connection and acting in ways that support it. This means that virtue is not only personal, but relational. It involves fairness, honesty, and responsibility toward others. A person who acts with clarity but ignores the impact of their actions on others is not fully aligned with reason. This balance between inner stability and outward responsibility becomes a defining feature of his philosophy. It avoids the extremes of withdrawal and overattachment. A person remains engaged with the world, but not controlled by it. He also addressed the question of success and failure in a way that challenges common assumptions. In ordinary thinking, success is measured by outcomes, achieving goals, gaining recognition, or avoiding loss. But in his view, these measures are unreliable because they depend on factors beyond control. Instead, he redefined success as alignment with reason and virtue. A person succeeds when they act correctly, regardless of the outcome. A person fails when they abandon clarity and act from confusion or impulse, even if the result appears favorable. This shift removes much of the instability associated with external measures. It allows for a form of consistency, where the quality of life does not rise and fall with changing circumstances. As his philosophy continued to develop, it became clear that what he was offering was not a temporary solution to specific problems, but a framework that could be applied across all aspects of life. Whether dealing with loss, uncertainty, relationships, or responsibility, the same principles remain relevant. But this also means that the philosophy is demanding. It does not offer comfort through avoidance or distraction. It requires continuous effort, a willingness to examine one's own thinking, and the discipline to act in accordance with that examination. By this stage, his system had moved beyond simple ideas into a structured practice, one that addresses not just what to think, but how to live. It provides a way of navigating a world that cannot be controlled without falling into frustration or passivity. And within that structure lies a deeper implication. Stability is not something that comes from the outside. It is something that must be built within through the ongoing effort to align thought, action, and understanding with the reality that unfolds, regardless of whether it matches expectation. As his philosophy continued to mature, what began to take clearer shape was the depth of transformation it demanded, not just in thought, but in perception itself. It was no longer only about reacting differently to events or controlling impulses in difficult moments. It was about changing the way reality is seen at a fundamental level. He understood that most people do not simply live in the world as it is. They live in a version of it shaped by expectation, fear, desire, and constant interpretation. What happens is rarely accepted as it is. It is immediately compared to what should have happened, what could have happened, or what was hoped for. This gap between reality and expectation becomes the source of ongoing tension. In his view, this tension is not necessary. It is created. This realization pushes his philosophy into a deeper space. The problem is no longer just emotional reaction. It is the structure of thought that produces those reactions. As long as a person measures reality against personal expectation, dissatisfaction becomes almost inevitable. So the task becomes more demanding. It is not just to endure events calmly, but to see them without distortion. To remove the added layer of judgment that turns neutral situations into sources of distress. This does not mean that everything becomes easy or pleasant. It means that difficulty is experienced without the additional weight of resistance. Pain may still exist, loss may still occur, but they are no longer amplified by the belief that they should not be happening. He also deepened his understanding of desire, recognizing it as one of the most powerful forces shaping human behavior. Desire, in itself, is not the problem. The issue arises when it is directed toward things that are uncertain, unstable, or outside control. When a person becomes attached to outcomes, whether it is success, recognition, or security, they place their sense of stability in something that cannot be guaranteed. This creates a constant state of vulnerability. Even when things go well, there is the underlying fear that they may not continue. His response to this is not to eliminate desire completely, but to redirect it. Desire should be aligned with what can actually be controlled: one's own actions, judgments, and intentions. When desire is placed in these areas, it becomes stable because it is no longer dependent on external conditions. This shift changes the entire experience of striving. Effort remains, but anxiety begins to fade. A person can work, aim, and act without being tied to the result in a way that creates distress. At the same time, he expanded his idea of acceptance into something more active and deliberate. It is not simply tolerating what happens. It is recognizing that events unfold within a larger order that does not revolve around individual preference. This recognition brings a kind of perspective. Instead of viewing events as personal disruptions, they can be seen as part of a broader structure. This does not remove their impact, but it changes their meaning. They are no longer seen as violations of how things should be, but as expressions of how things are. This shift is subtle, but powerful. It reduces the sense of conflict between the individual and the world. Life is no longer experienced as a constant struggle to force reality into a desired shape. It becomes something that can be engaged with more directly without the added layer of resistance. He also placed greater emphasis on consistency. It is not enough to apply these principles occasionally in moments of reflection or calm. They must be present in everyday life, in small decisions as well as major ones. The way a person reacts to minor inconvenience is not separate from how they respond to larger challenges. Both reflect the same underlying patterns. This means that the philosophy must become continuous. It cannot remain theoretical or occasional. It must shape perception at all times, gradually becoming a natural way of responding rather than something that requires constant effort. At the same time, he remained aware that this level of consistency is difficult to achieve. People do not change instantly. Habits are strong, and moments of clarity are often followed by periods of distraction or inconsistency. But he did not treat this as failure. He saw it as part of the process. The goal is not perfection in every moment, but gradual alignment over time. Each instance of awareness strengthens the ability to respond differently in the future. He also returned to the idea of social connection, adding more depth to how individuals relate to others within this framework. If all human beings are part of the same rational order, then actions toward others cannot be separated from actions toward oneself. Harm, dishonesty, or neglect disrupt not only the social structure, but the internal alignment of the person who acts in that way. This creates a form of ethical consistency. Acting well is not just a duty imposed from outside. It is part of maintaining internal clarity. A person cannot be stable within themselves while acting in ways that contradict reason in relation to others. By this stage, his philosophy presents a complete way of engaging with life. It addresses thought, emotion, action, and relationship, not as separate categories, but as interconnected aspects of a single process. It does not remove difficulty, uncertainty, or limitation. Instead, it offers a way of moving through them without losing stability. It shifts the focus away from controlling the world and toward understanding how to exist within it with clarity and discipline. And within that shift lies something that is both simple and extremely demanding. That the quality of life is not determined by what happens, but by how clearly one is able to see it, respond to it, and remain aligned with a structure that does not change according to individual desire, but remains consistent, whether it is accepted or resisted. As his life moved toward its later years, what becomes increasingly clear is that his philosophy was never meant to remain at the level of ideas alone. By this stage, everything he had been developing begins to converge into something far more demanding, a complete way of being that does not separate thought from action or understanding from daily life. It is no longer about learning principles. It is about becoming the kind of person for whom those principles are no longer optional, but natural. He understood that the greatest challenge is not discovering what is true, but maintaining that truth in the middle of ordinary life. It is one thing to recognize that external events are beyond control when thinking calmly. It is another to hold that understanding when facing loss, insult, uncertainty, or fear. This is where most people begin to lose clarity, not because they do not know what is right, but because the pressure of the moment pulls them back into old patterns. This is why his philosophy, at its deepest level, becomes a practice of constant awareness. A person must repeatedly return to the distinction between what can be controlled and what cannot, until it is no longer something they remind themselves of, but something they naturally see. The mind must be trained to recognize its own reactions in real time, to catch the moment where interpretation begins to distort reality. He saw clearly that without this level of awareness, even the best ideas lose their power. They remain as knowledge, but they do not shape behavior. And when knowledge and action separate, a person begins to live in contradiction, understanding one thing, but reacting in another way. At the same time, he deepened his reflection on the nature of control itself. Most people believe they control far more than they actually do. They try to manage outcomes, other people, future events, and even how they are perceived. But all of these remain uncertain. The more energy is placed into controlling them, the more instability is created. By contrast, what remains consistently within reach is much smaller, but far more reliable. Judgment, intention, and action. These are the only areas where control is real, not absolute, but direct enough to be meaningful. This realization changes the entire direction of effort. Instead of spreading attention across everything that might happen, it becomes concentrated on how one chooses to think, and act in each moment. This creates a form of stability that does not depend on circumstances aligning in a certain way. But he also recognized that this shift is not easy to sustain. The world constantly pulls attention outward. It encourages comparison, attachment, and reaction. It rewards outcomes rather than clarity. This creates a tension between the internal discipline he describes and the external environment people live in. He did not ignore this tension. He accepted it as part of reality. The task is not to remove oneself completely from the world, but to remain clear within it, to participate without becoming dependent, to act without becoming attached, to engage without losing balance. This balance becomes one of the most refined aspects of his philosophy. It is not withdrawal, and it is not immersion without awareness. It is a steady position between the two, where a person remains active, responsible, and involved, but does not allow external conditions to determine their internal state. He also continued to develop the idea of resilience, not as something built through force or resistance, but through understanding. A person becomes resilient not by hardening themselves against the world, but by no longer expecting the world to behave according to their preferences. When expectation is reduced, frustration begins to decrease. When attachment to outcomes is loosened, fear begins to lose its intensity. What remains is a more stable way of moving through situations where difficulty is met without collapse and change is faced without panic. At the same time, he returned once again to the importance of community, but with greater depth. Human beings are not meant to live in isolation, and living according to nature includes recognizing one's role within a larger whole. But this participation must also be guided by reason. A person should contribute, act fairly, and engage with others, not out of obligation alone, but because it reflects a clear understanding of how human life is structured. Cooperation is not just practical. It is part of living in alignment with reality. This reinforces the idea that inner clarity and external action cannot be separated. A person who is internally stable but acts without regard for others is not fully aligned. And a person who acts well externally but lacks clarity internally remains unstable. Both dimensions must develop together. As his philosophy reaches its final form, it becomes clear that what he offers is not comfort, but strength. Not the kind of strength that comes from controlling the world, but the kind that comes from no longer depending on that control. It is a quiet strength, one that does not draw attention to itself, but remains steady through change. It does not remove difficulty, but it prevents difficulty from becoming overwhelming. It does not eliminate uncertainty, but it allows a person to move through it without losing direction. He died around 262 BCE, leaving behind a foundation that would be developed by later Stoic thinkers, expanded, refined, and carried forward across centuries. But what remains most powerful about his work is not its historical influence, but its clarity. It presents a simple but demanding truth: that the world will not adjust itself to meet individual expectations, that events will continue to unfold in ways that cannot be fully predicted or controlled, and that within this reality, the only stable ground is the way one chooses to think, to judge, and to act. In the end, his philosophy does not promise an easier life. It offers something more difficult, but more lasting. A way of living where stability is not dependent on what happens, but on how clearly one is able to see it, accept it, and respond to it without losing alignment. And once that alignment begins to take hold, even briefly, something changes. The world remains the same, unpredictable, shifting, often indifferent. But the experience of moving through it becomes steadier, less reactive, less driven by fear or expectation. Not because the world has improved, but because the way of seeing it has.